Kash Patel had been sounding the alarm long before anyone wanted to listen. As someone who had worked closely within the national security and intelligence communities, he wasn't known for idle speculation. He paid close attention to patterns in geopolitical threats or in the domestic political landscape, and over time, he began noticing something troubling about the direction California was headed under Governor Gavin Newsom's leadership. Patel wasn't driven by personal animosity toward Newsom. In fact, he rarely even named him at first. But as he continued to study California's deteriorating conditions, his concerns became more pointed. Homelessness wasn't just rising, it was exploding in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Oakland. 10 cities were becoming semi-permanent features of public parks, sidewalks, and underpasses. Mental health and substance abuse crises were playing out in plain sight, and yet there seemed to be no coherent, long-term strategy to deal with them. What bothered Patel most wasn't the presence of these problems. Every state faces challenges, but the refusal by those in charge to acknowledge the reality of the situation. He often cited data from independent sources: crime statistics, housing reports, economic flight numbers. These weren't partisan metrics. They were factual indicators showing that California was, in several key areas, falling apart at the seams. Businesses were relocating. Middle-class families were leaving. Small business owners, particularly in inner cities, were closing shop due to a mix of high taxes, rampant theft, and regulatory hurdles. Patel started voicing his concerns more directly in interviews, podcasts, and public statements. He emphasized that leadership requires confronting hard truths, not masking them behind polished press events and ambitious rhetoric. He pointed out that while California remained a hub for innovation and culture, those very strengths were being undercut by unstable infrastructure and a growing disconnect between government policy and everyday reality. He saw a dangerous pattern emerging. Instead of course correction, there was deflection. State leadership leaned into grand ideals and sweeping narratives, often using California as a model for progressive governance. But the facts on the ground told a different story. Crime rates in key urban areas were spiking, particularly violent crimes and organized retail theft. Law enforcement was being stretched thin and, in some cases, demoralized by policy decisions that appeared to favor ideological purity over public safety. Patel also highlighted the state's education system, another area where the cracks were widening. Test scores were falling, parental frustration was rising, and yet the focus from Sacramento seemed to be elsewhere, wrapped up in national debates or abstract equity initiatives instead of direct academic outcomes. He warned that these weren't isolated issues but interconnected ones. The failure to address core problems like public safety, housing, and education wouldn't stay localized for long. They would eventually impact California's reputation, economy, and even its role in national politics. Throughout his warnings, Patel maintained a steady tone. He wasn't shouting or pointing fingers for the sake of performance. He was trying to redirect attention to what he believed truly mattered: governance grounded in results, not image. And to him, Newsom was falling short not because of a lack of talent or charisma, but because of a refusal to reassess priorities. The governor, Patel believed, was focused on future ambitions, possibly a White House run, while the state under his watch was showing signs of severe strain. He understood the political game. Newsom was a polished communicator, a skilled strategist, and someone who knew how to manage optics. But Patel warned that optics don't build trust, especially when people are facing real-world struggles. Voters, he said, might support you for a time based on your ideals, but eventually, they measure you by outcomes. And if the outcomes continue to worsen, no amount of media appearances or carefully crafted speeches will be enough. What made Patel's message stand out was that he wasn't speaking like a campaign surrogate or political rival. He was speaking like someone who had seen what happens when leaders ignore early warnings. He wasn't predicting disaster with glee. He was trying to signal that it could still be avoided if someone had the courage to stop, look around, and change course. While Kash Patel was raising flags about the state's deteriorating conditions, Gavin Newsom was moving in a different direction, one that emphasized national visibility over internal repair. To many observers, Newsom's public strategy became increasingly clear. Instead of narrowing his focus on California's pressing issues, he seemed to be positioning himself for a broader political stage. Television interviews on major networks, international trips to discuss climate policy, and social media videos that mocked conservative governors all contributed to a growing perception. Gavin Newsom was playing a national game. Patel noticed this shift and spoke candidly about it. He pointed out how Newsom appeared to be more interested in competing with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in public narratives than addressing the failing infrastructure and governance challenges at home. In one interview, Patel remarked that, while Newsom was busy making national commercials targeting red states, his own state was struggling with rising crime an overwhelmed foster care system, and a shrinking tax base. Patel warned that this kind of distraction, where messaging outruns performance, would ultimately backfire. Newsom's media appearances became more frequent and carefully crafted. He presented California as a beacon of progressive values, a model for the future of the country. He talked about climate leadership, LGBTQ rights, and COVID-19 management with confident flair. But as Patel pointed out, those highlights were often used to cover up the less glamorous realities of governing. The state's high cost of living was pushing out working-class families. Small businesses were closing their doors. And in major cities, homelessness was no longer confined to isolated neighborhoods. It was sprawling into business districts and suburban communities. Even as these realities worsened, Newsom rarely shifted focus. Instead, he seemed to double down on public relations. He launched a political action committee aimed at exporting California-style policies to other states. He was frequently mentioned as a possible substitute for Joe Biden in the next presidential cycle, a whisper campaign that some believed his team encouraged behind the scenes. But in doing so, he drifted further from the practical demands of running the state. Patel criticized this move as short-sighted. He said that leadership requires staying grounded, especially when the spotlight starts to expand. He noted that every minute spent building a national profile without addressing local failures would come back around. You don't build a presidential campaign on shaky ground, he said. If your own house is in disarray, people will notice, especially voters in other parts of the country who don't buy into the headlines. While Newsom projected confidence on national issues, several of his in-state initiatives began to falter. A high-speed rail project continued to bleed money with minimal progress. Wildfire management remained inconsistent despite fire seasons. Water infrastructure reform was repeatedly delayed. Meanwhile, Patel continued to highlight these issues not to score political points, but to draw attention to a growing disconnect between leadership and reality. One of the clearest examples of this disconnect was the rollout of statewide programs intended to address homelessness. Billions of dollars were allocated, but many critics noted the lack of measurable progress. Patel questioned the transparency of how those funds were used and whether the governor was willing to admit the limitations of his strategies. Rather than recalibrating, Newsom pressed on with the same messaging that California was leading the way. But to many Californians, Democrats and Republicans alike, that message began to feel more like spin than truth. Public sentiment gradually started shifting. Approval ratings dipped, especially among independent voters. Key constituencies in cities like San Diego and Fresno voiced frustration. Local mayors and city officials began to speak more openly about the lack of state-level support. Patel observed that this was the political cost of ignoring hard feedback. Leaders can survive missteps, he argued, but only if they demonstrate a willingness to learn and change course. Newsom, in his view, was not doing that. Instead, he was managing his image while key systems within the state continued to erode. Even some within Newsom's own party grew uneasy. Legislative allies who once defended his decisions began offering more cautious statements. Donors who supported his early campaigns started asking tougher questions. Behind the scenes, there was a growing recognition that the governor's national play was coming at the expense of his state-level responsibilities. And Kash Patel, watching the pattern unfold, wasn't surprised. He had warned from the beginning that prioritizing personal ambition over local leadership would come with a price. The moment that changed everything came quietly, almost unexpectedly. It wasn't a scandal or a policy failure, it was a single, viral moment that exposed what had been building for years. A bipartisan task force, made up of both Democratic and Republican lawmakers, declared San Francisco's Tenderloin district a humanitarian disaster zone. The language was blunt, and so were the images that accompanied the announcement. Photos and videos circulated widely online, blocks of streets lined with tents, individuals suffering openly from addiction, and families navigating around trash and used needles. This wasn't campaign rhetoric. It was real, undeniable, and impossible to spin. Kash Patel didn't need to say much in response. He had been warning about this kind of reckoning for months, if not longer. The state's ongoing issues, especially in urban centers like San Francisco and Los Angeles, never abstract points in a debate to him. He had consistently pointed to the data, the policy gaps, and the growing frustration on the ground. Now, all of it had broken through into the national conversation, and Gavin Newsom's image as a forward-thinking, in-control leader was starting to slip. Almost overnight, a series of dominoes began to fall. Tech executives in Silicon Valley, many of whom had long supported Newsom with donations and public endorsements, began speaking more candidly. Some openly criticized the lack of results despite massive spending on homelessness and urban revitalization. Others chose distancing themselves from political conversations they once engaged in enthusiastically. For a figure like Newsom, whose political strength was deeply tied to the loyalty of California's wealthy elite, this was a noticeable shift. Kash Patel weighed in during a media interview just days after the story broke. He didn't gloat, but he didn't sugarcoat the situation either. This isn't about being right. It's about what happens when real issues are ignored in favor of a polished narrative. The people on the ground, residents, workers, small business owners, have been shouting about this for years. Now everyone else is finally listening. Patel emphasized that it didn't take a national story to see what was happening. It only took the willingness to look. As national media outlets began covering the story, a broader pattern emerged. California was no longer being discussed as a model of progressive leadership, but rather as a cautionary tale. Publications that once praised its innovation and cultural influence were now asking tougher questions. Why had billions of taxpayer dollars failed to fix homelessness? Why were major businesses relocating to Texas, Florida, and Arizona? Why was crime increasing despite expansive social programs? Patel argued that these weren't new questions, they were just finally being asked loudly enough to matter. And for Newsom, the political consequences were starting to pile up. Internal polling, some of which was leaked to the press, showed an erosion of support among key demographics. Independent voters, especially in suburban counties, were turning away. Hispanic and Asian American communities, once strong backers of Newsom's policies, voiced concerns about rising costs, public safety, and the quality of public services. These groups weren't moving right politically, they were simply losing patience. What made the situation more difficult for Newsom was that his national ambitions had never been a secret. For months, political insiders had speculated that he was preparing to step into the 2028 presidential race or even 2024 if needed. He was frequently mentioned in Democratic strategy meetings as a potential contender. But as the news cycle turned negative, those conversations began to shift. Strategists started floating other names. Donors began investing in backup options. Party operatives, always sensitive to optics, stopped referencing Newsom as a rising star and began referring to him in the past tense. Kash Patel saw it happening in real time. He noted the subtle but unmistakable signs, the way Democratic leadership avoided tying themselves to Newsom publicly. The sudden drop in cable news invitations, the social media silence from longtime allies. In his view, this was the natural result of ignoring reality for too long. Politics isn't just about messaging, he said in a later appearance. Eventually, people will judge you by results, and if the results aren't there, the machine turns on you. Even within California, support started to thin. Local leaders who once praised Newsom's boldness became more cautious in their endorsements. Mayors and city council members started looking for their own solutions rather than waiting for direction from Sacramento. The political ground was shifting quickly, and Patel, who had called out these structural weaknesses all along, was once again proven correct. Gavin Newsom's rise in the Democratic Party was once seen as inevitable. Charismatic, telegenic, and armed with a progressive policy record, he seemed poised to be a future national contender. But after the fallout from California's most visible failures, particularly the viral exposure of the state's homelessness and crime issues, those inside the Democratic establishment began to shift their focus elsewhere. The unspoken truth became harder to ignore. Newsom's national viability had taken a serious hit, and Kash Patel, who had been issuing calm, consistent warnings all along, saw it coming before anyone else would admit it. Patel had emphasized that political capital isn't infinite. It's earned and re-earned through performance, not just messaging. In several interviews and speaking engagements, he laid out how Newsom's growing disconnect from ground-level realities would not just hurt him in California, it would ripple outward, especially among party leaders and national donors. You can only outrun results for so long, Patel said. Eventually, the donors, the voters, and the party decision-makers catch up. That moment arrived more quietly than it began. There were no grand announcements, no public withdrawals. Instead, Newsom's name slowly began to vanish from key internal discussions within the Democratic National Committee. High-profile donors, who had once considered him a prime choice for future presidential campaigns, began placing their bets on others, candidates with stronger in-state records, less political baggage, and more resonance with Middle America voters. Strategists began prioritizing governors from battleground states, individuals who could speak credibly to swing voters. Newsom, despite his media presence and charisma, no longer fit that bill. Kash Patel commented on this soft sidelining during an appearance on a national podcast. He wasn't gleeful, he was pragmatic. When you ignore repeated feedback from the people you serve, and you focus on shaping a legacy before earning it, this is what happens. Newsom thought national recognition could substitute for local credibility. But credibility doesn't scale unless it's built from results. In Patel's view, the most damaging part of Newsom's trajectory wasn't just the policy failures, it was the refusal to course correct. He had the political room to make changes. He had opportunities to shift focus, reinvest in California's urgent problems, and reframe his leadership in a more grounded way. Instead, he continued to chase a narrative that he was already a national figure, skipping steps that Patel believed were essential in gaining long-term trust from voters beyond California's borders. The impact wasn't just internal. Media outlets that had once celebrated Newsom's boldness began running features on the growing dissent within his own state. Voter frustration became a recurring theme in coverage. Local news stations started highlighting neighborhoods that felt abandoned, while national publications questioned whether California's progressive policies were delivering on their promises. These weren't partisan attacks, they were grounded in personal stories, public data, and bipartisan concern. As Patel had pointed out months earlier, the public doesn't always move in lockstep with political narratives. Voters may buy into optimism for a while, but they eventually align with lived experience. And when their neighborhoods felt less safe, when their schools struggled, and when their taxes kept rising without visible improvement, the disconnect became too wide to ignore. What made Patel's perspective resonate even more was that he didn't frame this as a victory for the opposition. He framed it as a failure of leadership, one that could have been avoided if ego had been set aside in favor of accountability. Within Democratic circles, there was a quiet reckoning. Few would criticize Newsom openly, but many began positioning themselves elsewhere. Potential primary challengers started building national operations. Party operatives began inviting other governors to headline major fundraising events, who, just a year prior, would have taken a backseat to Newsom. The conversation had moved on, and Patel's prediction had played out exactly as he said it would. What remained was a sense of what might have been. Gavin Newsom was still governor, still powerful within California, but his broader ambitions now seemed out of reach. His moment, which once looked so inevitable, had passed sidelined not by scandal, but by a quiet erosion of trust. Kash Patel, who had warned him early and often, didn't need to say much more. His point had already been proven, not through rhetoric, but through the decisions of the very people Newsom had hoped would elevate him to the next level. In the end, the story of Gavin Newsom's political arc is not one of sudden collapse, but of quiet consequence. It is a case study in how ambition, when untethered from accountability, can lead even the most promising careers into uncertain territory. Newsom's rise was fueled by bold ideals and sweeping rhetoric, but as the foundation beneath him weakened from homelessness to crime to economic stagnation, his national image began to fracture. The spotlight that once elevated him started revealing the gaps he had failed to address. Kash Patel's role in this narrative wasn't that of a partisan antagonist, but rather a voice of caution. His criticisms were rooted not in personal disdain, but in a sincere call for grounded leadership. Time and again, he pointed to the widening gap between messaging and reality, urging leaders Newsom included to stay connected to the needs of the people they serve. And when others dismissed those warnings as political noise, Patel held firm. Not because he sought validation, but because he recognized the stakes involved. What happened with Newsom should serve as a larger reflection for political leaders across the spectrum. Governance isn't about winning arguments on social media or making waves on national television. It's about results, tangible improvements in people's lives, especially those who don't have the luxury of waiting for promises to materialize. California under Newsom became a place of contrast, one that boasted progressive leadership while struggling with issues that demanded practical, bipartisan solutions. The unraveling of Newsom's national momentum wasn't orchestrated by a single opponent or scandal. It was the culmination of 1,000 missed opportunities to recalibrate. It came from communities that felt unheard, small business owners who felt overtaxed and underserved, and public servants who worked tirelessly without clear support from above. And as those voices grew louder, even Newsom's closest political allies began to sense the shift. Meanwhile, Kash Patel's steady commentary gained quiet credibility. He didn't seek the limelight, he simply pointed out, again and again, that public trust is earned through action, not image. And when the moment of reckoning arrived, it was his voice that seemed more prescient than partisan. It wasn't about taking down a governor. It was about recognizing that the cost of ignoring hard truths is often paid in political capital and eventually, in public support. Now, as the political winds continue to shift, the lesson is clear. In a world of fast headlines and fleeting applause, the leaders who endure are those who stay rooted in responsibility. For Gavin Newsom, the warning came early from Kash Patel, and now the consequences are playing out in real time, as the nation watches a once rising star come face to face with the reality he chose.